Under the dim glow of a city that never truly slept, New York in the early 20th century pulsed with a raw, electric tension. An undercurrent of ambition, poverty, and silent wars fought in alleyways and smoky backrooms. It was in this restless atmosphere that a new breed of criminal would rise, not with the crude brutality of street thugs, but with the vision of a strategist and the cold precision of a chess master. Before anyone knew his name, before newspapers called him the architect of organized crime, Charles Lucky Luciano was already reshaping the shadows. His story did not begin with a gunshot or a betrayal, but with a single idea: that chaos could be controlled, that crime could be managed like a corporation, and that power could flow quietly through invisible channels built by those who understood both fear and opportunity. The city around him was split between old-world traditions and a new-world hunger for wealth. Immigrants poured into Manhattan chasing survival, not dreams. Police corruption was rampant, politicians were bought like commodities, and prohibition had just thrown gasoline onto an already burning criminal landscape. Alcohol, though illegal, flowed through the boroughs like a second bloodstream. Hidden bars and nightclubs thrived, and behind them stood gangs who saw prohibition not as a restriction but as an invitation. In this swelling underground economy, Luciano walked not as a mere participant but as someone who studied the chaos with the eyes of a reformer, one who saw inefficiency everywhere. Where others saw street corners and territories, he saw structure. Where others enforced silence with fear alone, he saw leverage, alliances, and the possibility of a crime empire that operated with the discipline of Wall Street. Yet his rise was neither instant nor easy. The old Mafia, dominated by the mustache Petes, clung to tradition like a shield. They distrusted innovation, resented collaboration with non-Italians, and believed power had to be inherited, not constructed. Luciano understood something far more modern. Power was not given, it was engineered. He knew that strength came from networks, not nostalgia. As he navigated the violent labyrinth of early gang life, he cultivated relationships not just with Sicilians, but with Jews, Irishmen, and anyone who understood business better than blood feuds. This made him both a revolutionary and a target. But instead of retreating into ethnic loyalties, he stepped beyond them, embracing a multi-ethnic criminal coalition the old guard considered sacrilege. In that daring move, Luciano laid the first invisible brick of an empire that would eventually redefine organized crime across America. The transformation he envisioned was not simply about profit, it was about control. He believed the underworld could function like a government, one without elections, without bureaucracy, powered solely by a balance of fear, respect, and efficiency. He understood the psychology of men who lived outside the law, their craving for recognition, their susceptibility to pride, their fear of being left behind. He learned how to manipulate these instincts with a disarming calm that became his signature. While others barked orders or brandished knives, Luciano often spoke softly, offering logic where others delivered threats. But beneath that calm lay a ruthless clarity. Anyone who stood in the way of reform, anyone who clung to outdated hierarchies, would be removed. Not for revenge, not out of anger, but in the name of progress. New York streets were filled with stories of ambitious young men, but most of them ended in prison or an unmarked grave. Luciano's story endured because he understood the art of survival. He cultivated a persona that was both approachable and untouchable. Friends called him Charlie. Enemies called him Lucky. The press later claimed the nickname came from an early escape from death, stabbed, beaten, left for dead. But those who knew him understood the truth. His luck was engineered by preparation, by loyalty earned rather than assumed, and by a strategic mind capable of staying several moves ahead. Even in the shadows, he carried himself like someone who already envisioned victory. The era around him was changing too quickly for the old guard to comprehend. Prohibition had created millionaires out of nobodies. Street kids became ruthless entrepreneurs. Bootleggers controlled more capital than small banks. Politicians whispered names in backrooms that were never spoken on the record. The city's pulse beat in sync with deals made over barrels of whiskey and shipments of narcotics. Luciano understood that whoever controlled this new economy would control the future of organized crime in America. And so, he positioned himself at the center of it, never directly visible, always indispensable. But beneath the rise lay an even deeper question, one that shaped his psychological evolution. What does power cost a man who must live without the light of legitimacy? Luciano's world required lies, tactics, silence, and occasionally blood. Yet he pursued dominance not with the flamboyance of a brute, but with the calculation of a statesman. He read people, anticipated betrayals, and understood that fear alone was fragile. Real power, he believed, lay in systems, structures that could endure even if he disappeared. That was the difference between a gangster and a visionary. Most men wanted control of a neighborhood. Luciano wanted influence over an entire era. In the introduction to his story, one can feel the tension between the world as it was and the world Luciano sought to create. His life would become a mirror reflecting the contradictions of the American underworld: loyalty and treachery, ambition and downfall, brilliance wrapped in brutality. As New York's skyline expanded upward, Luciano built a darker architecture beneath it. Hidden networks, silent alliances, and the first blueprint of a criminal corporation that would outlive him. This is not merely the tale of a mobster. It is the story of a man who rebuilt the American underworld with the discipline of an engineer and the instincts of a survivor. A man who turned crime into a system, influence into an economy, and fear into a subtle, lasting form of governance. It begins in the shadows, but its impact stretches far beyond them. A legacy written not in law books, but in the hidden structures that shaped decades of organized crime. Before Lucky Luciano ever stepped into the spotlight of criminal history, the American underworld was a fractured, volatile landscape. More a battlefield than a business, more chaos than structure. The early 20th century Mafia in the United States was not the polished hierarchy familiar to later generations. It was a turbulent stew of Sicilian traditions, neighborhood rivalries, and immigrant struggles that bled into violence on nearly every street. Each gang operated like a fiefdom. Every boss was a king in his own mind. And every corner was a border worth killing for. This wasn't organized crime, it was survival chaos, an ecosystem where respect was measured by bodies and territory was maintained through fear alone. Much of this disorder came from the Mustache Petes, the old-world mafiosi who clung to Sicilian customs as tightly as they held their grudges. These men believed in secrecy, rigid hierarchy, and ethnic exclusivity. To them, the mafia was not a business opportunity but a cultural inheritance, something passed from generation to generation with strict rules and unbreakable rituals. They trusted only those born on their soil, raised in their villages, shaped by their shared poverty and memories of the old country. In America, however, the world had changed. New York was no longer a Sicilian village. It was a roaring industrial giant swallowing immigrants by the thousands, forcing them to adapt or vanish. But the Mustache Petes refused to adapt. They ruled with outdated methods: silence, vengeance, isolation, and they rejected any ideas that threatened their authority. Meanwhile, the streets of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx were evolving faster than they could comprehend. The influx of immigrants created tightly packed ethnic enclaves. Italians lived next to Jews, Jews next to Irish, Irish next to Eastern Europeans. Cultures blended, clashed, and occasionally cooperated, creating new forms of criminal opportunity. But the old mafia refused to work with outsiders, even when outsiders controlled half the city's black market power. The Jewish mob, led by sharp strategists like Meyer Lansky and Arnold Rothstein, dominated gambling and bootlegging finance. Irish gangs controlled docks, unions, and smuggling routes. These were heavyweights in the criminal world, yet the Mustache Petes dismissed them as unworthy partners. Their pride became a prison, forcing them into unnecessary wars and expensive vendettas that drained energy, money, and time. Then Prohibition arrived in 1920, and the country entered a new era where criminals became the accidental kings of industry. The illegal liquor trade exploded into a multi-million-dollar business overnight. Speakeasies multiplied, bootleggers turned into entrepreneurs, and gangsters found themselves running operations that resembled corporations more than street rackets. But this sudden wealth also magnified tensions. Instead of adapting to the new economic order, many gang bosses doubled down on territorial thinking. They guarded their routes with bullets instead of negotiations. They fought over distribution, suppliers, and alliances. Turf wars erupted at a scale unseen before. Bodies piled up in alleys, gunfire echoed through residential blocks, and newspapers framed the streets as war zones. The mafia itself was split into factions rooted in old country politics. Sicilians from different villages carried ancient hostilities into New York. Men who were neighbors in one lifetime became mortal enemies in another. Even within the same criminal network, bosses distrusted one another. Some believed the future lay in adapting to American life. Others insisted that loyalty to Sicilian bloodlines was the only path. This ideological divide became a ticking bomb, and when Prohibition money strengthened every faction, the explosion became inevitable. Law enforcement at the time was no better organized than the criminals. Police departments were riddled with corruption, often serving as accomplices, suppliers, or informants to whichever gang paid better. Politicians exploited gang alliances to secure votes and power. Entire neighborhoods existed in a haze of bribes and intimidation. The legal system was easily manipulated, allowing criminals to walk free as long as they had money and connections. In this murky world, power shifted unpredictably. One day a gang leader could be drinking champagne in a nightclub. The next he could be lying dead in a gutter, replaced by someone younger, hungrier, and more ruthless. This environment created a paradox. Crime was incredibly profitable, yet incredibly unstable. The old guard wanted control but resisted the cooperation it required. Younger criminals saw opportunity but lacked the authority to build something lasting. Every attempt at forming alliances failed because mistrust outweighed logic. Each boss believed he could dominate the others, and so the wars continued. Small wars, large wars, personal vendettas, family grudges, and an endless parade of retaliatory killings that weakened everyone equally. Before Luciano, there was no unified mafia commission. There was no standardized system of arbitration. There was no shared vision of peace or profit. A single insult could ignite a feud. A single misunderstanding could start a war. As New York's population grew, so did the territory and the conflicts that came with it. Fragmentation became a way of life. Even powerful bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who would later dominate the Castellammarese War, were ultimately fighting over a throne that didn't yet exist. They wanted to be kings without a kingdom, rulers without a system, architects without blueprints. The criminal underworld before Luciano was almost feudal. Families operated independently, and most failed to recognize the potential of centralized leadership. They did not see the possibility of a networked underworld governed by shared rules, mutual profit, and strategic diplomacy. They only saw their enemies, real or imagined, and the immediate threat to their pride. In a world where tradition dictated loyalty but paranoia controlled behavior, survival meant constant readiness for violence. And yet, amidst this storm of fragmentation, something significant was happening beneath the surface. Younger gangsters, American-born or American-raised, were quietly learning from the chaos. They watched how the old guard failed to adapt. They observed how millions were lost to egos and vendettas. They recognized the opportunities that came with cooperation, diversification, and modernization. These young men, including Luciano, Lansky, Genovese, Siegel, and others, understood America in ways the mustache Petes never could. They spoke English, navigated multicultural environments, and interacted with businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement with a kind of agility that old-world bosses lacked. They were the first generation to see organized crime not as a tradition, but as an industry. By the time Luciano began rising through the ranks, the criminal kingdom was ripe for transformation. The instability, the outdated leadership, the violent rivalries, all of it created a vacuum that only someone with vision could fill. The American underworld was ready for reform, even if it didn't realize it. All it needed was a man who could bridge the gap between old and new, between Sicilian loyalty and American ambition, between chaos and order. Before Lucky Luciano rebuilt the American Mafia, the underworld was a fractured world waiting for a leader who could see past bloodlines and borders. In that fractured landscape, his rise was not only possible, it was inevitable. The story of Lucky Luciano's rise truly begins long before he earned his nickname, before the newspapers crowned him a criminal mastermind, before the commission, the alliances, or the wars. It starts in the rough, sun-bleached hills of Lercara Fritti, a small Sicilian mining town where survival meant hard labor, rigid tradition, and a constant awareness of who held power and who did not. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, into a world where poverty pressed on families like a second skin. Crime was not a profession, it was a background hum, whispers of local mafia figures, disputes settled quietly, an unspoken hierarchy that every villager understood even if no one said it plainly. As a child, he saw firsthand how fear and respect could shape an entire community. He would later translate these early lessons into a far more sophisticated form of power. His parents, like countless others, dreamed of a better life, a chance to escape the grinding struggle that Sicily offered. And so in 1906, when Salvatore was 9 years old, the Lucania family boarded a ship to America, believing the United States would give their children the opportunities Italy never could. What they found instead was the Lower East Side of Manhattan, crowded, chaotic, alive with energy yet suffocating in its own way. Immigrant families were packed into tenement buildings where cramped rooms, disease, and hunger were constant companions. Streets smelled of sweat, garbage, and ambition. People hustled not because they wanted to but because they had no other choice. For young Salvatore, this world was both brutal and transformative. He spoke no English, had no money, and watched his father labor endlessly to earn barely enough to keep the family afloat. School offered structure, but it couldn't compete with the lessons the streets taught him. Lessons about survival, negotiation, danger, and opportunity. The Lower East Side was a melting pot of cultures, and for a boy with quick instincts and a sharp mind, it became the perfect training ground. It didn't take long for him to realize that being tough wasn't enough. One had to be smart. At age 10, he began running errands for older boys, delivering messages between gang members, carrying small packages, learning who controlled what and why. The streets taught him hierarchy, alliances, and the price of disrespect. He learned that fear could protect him, but strategy could elevate him. He watched as older immigrants clung to old-world rules that no longer worked in America, and he vowed never to make the same mistake. What truly shaped him, however, were the friendships he forged. On those crowded streets, he met Meyer Lansky, an analytical Jewish kid with piercing eyes and a mind for numbers. Their friendship would become one of the most influential alliances in American criminal history. Lansky was small but fearless, and Luciano admired that. The two understood each other on a different level. They shared hunger, ambition, and an ability to see beyond the boundaries their backgrounds tried to impose on them. In those early days, they didn't know they would one day reshape the underworld together, but they sensed they were different, more capable, more insightful, than the chaos around them. He also crossed paths with Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a volatile, charismatic Jewish teenager whose temper was matched only by his charm. Where Lansky brought discipline and calculation, Siegel brought audacity and aggression. Luciano gravitated toward both, recognizing that different qualities could be harnessed for different purposes. The trio would one day form the backbone of an empire, each contributing a distinct skill to their shared pursuit of power. By 14, Luciano had dropped out of school entirely. The streets paid more than any classroom ever could. He became involved in small rackets, extortion, card games, protection schemes directed at other kids. One of his earliest hustles was charging classmates a nickel each to avoid beatings from local bullies. If they paid, he ensured their safety. If they didn't, he allowed the bullies to do what they did. This crude but effective system taught him the basics of control. Power didn't come from violence alone, it came from using violence strategically. During his teenage years, he became involved with the 5 Points Gang, one of the most feared criminal organizations in New York at the time. Under the mentorship of Johnny Torrio and later with the influence of organized figures like Paul Kelly, he learned how adult criminals operated. He saw firsthand how money flowed, how deals were made, how loyalty was bought, and how betrayals were punished. The 5 Points Gang was a university of sorts, violent, unforgiving, but rich with knowledge for those smart enough to absorb it. Luciano was one of the star students. He also worked briefly at a garment factory, a job that was supposed to keep him out of trouble. But the monotony of legal labor only reinforced his belief that the path to success lay in the shadows. He quit and threw himself fully into street life. He began dressing sharply, carrying himself with confidence, learning to socialize with people of influence. He was not yet a boss, but he already acted like one. As he entered his 20s, Luciano developed another skill: diplomacy. He could switch languages effortlessly, from Sicilian dialect with old immigrants to polished English with local businessmen. He could drink with Irish gangsters, negotiate with Jewish bookmakers, and joke with Italian neighbors. In an era when ethnicity defined alliances, Luciano crossed boundaries with ease. This ability would one day become his greatest strength. He also learned the importance of composure. In a world where emotions led to impulsive violence, Luciano mastered calmness. Whether dealing with a rival, a police officer, or a potential ally, he rarely raised his voice. This unnerved people. It made him unpredictable, quietly dangerous. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His silence carried more weight than most men's fury. But his rise wasn't without scars. One near-fatal beating left him disfigured and earning the nickname Lucky. Some said he survived because of divine fortune. Others believed it was pure resilience. To Luciano, it was proof that he was destined for more, that fate had chosen him for something greater than the petty turf disputes dominating NYC's criminal scene. By the time he reached adulthood, Luciano was no longer just another street kid. He had become a figure of influence, someone older criminals watched with curiosity and younger ones followed with admiration. His intelligence, ambition, and understanding of both people and systems set him apart. He saw a future where crime could be streamlined, organized, and controlled, where ethnic rivalries would fade before the promise of profit. The rise of a street kid named Salvatore Lucania into the man who would one day be called Lucky Luciano wasn't built on brute force or blind luck. It was built on observation, adaptation, alliances, and an early understanding that America was changing, and that he could change with it. Every fight he witnessed, every deal he negotiated, every friend or foe he made shaped him into a man prepared not merely to survive the underworld, but to master it. By the time the 1920s roared into full motion, the boy who had once run errands on the Lower East Side had transformed into a young man with a keen sense of strategy and a growing reputation on the streets. The underworld was evolving, and so was he. Salvatore Lucania, now calling himself Charles Charlie Luciano, began shaping himself into something the old gangs had never seen before. A modern mobster who understood the psychology of power, the importance of alliances, and the value of playing the long game. He wasn't content with being a street soldier or even a neighborhood enforcer. He wanted to build something bigger, something structured, something that would outlive the chaotic turf wars poisoning New York's criminal scene. His ambition was no longer survival, it was dominance. One of the pivotal turning points in Luciano's evolution was his relationship with Arnold Rothstein, the legendary Jewish gambler and financier known throughout the city as the Brain. Rothstein was not a gangster in the traditional sense. He wore expensive suits, ran high-class gambling operations, and navigated the criminal world with the elegance of a businessman and the foresight of an investor. He was the kind of man Luciano aspired to become: controlled, calculating, respected by criminals and politicians alike. Under Rothstein's influence, Luciano discovered that crime could be managed with the same discipline as a corporate enterprise. Rothstein taught him that violence was costly, messy, and often unnecessary. Money, however, had a language everyone understood. Bribery, negotiation, and smart partnerships could achieve what bullets could not. This mentorship reshaped Luciano's worldview. He began thinking in terms of systems, not street corners. He studied Rothstein's operation like a student studying a master class. He learned about supply chains and bootlegging, distribution networks, political protection, union infiltration, and the subtle dance between legality and illegality that allowed Rothstein to move freely between prestigious hotels and backroom casinos. Luciano absorbed it all, every tactic, every calculation, every quiet exchange that shifted the balance of power. And with each lesson he drifted farther from the crude, tribal mentality of the Mustache Pete's. But even as he immersed himself in high-level criminal strategy, Luciano continued strengthening his network of allies. His closest partners, Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, became pillars of his rise. Genovese was fiercely loyal and frighteningly ruthless, the kind of man who could turn a threat into a corpse with no hesitation. Costello, on the other hand, was smooth-talking, politically connected, and gifted with the ability to read a room better than most men read books. Together, the three of them represented intelligence, brutality, and diplomacy, a perfect combination for the world Luciano envisioned. With prohibition fueling a criminal economy of unprecedented scale, Luciano saw opportunities everywhere. Bootlegging wasn't just a business, it was a blueprint for how all criminal activity could be organized. Instead of fighting over territories like desperate animals, he believed gangs should coordinate supply, share profits, and eliminate unnecessary risks. The Mustache Pete's refused to see it. They called him arrogant, too Americanized, too willing to work with non-Italians. But Luciano knew their time was fading. They clung to ancient codes and bloodlines while the world around them demanded adaptability. In the late 1920s, Luciano's role within Joe Boss Masuria's organization grew. Masuria was a powerful old-world don but also a man blinded by ego. He demanded loyalty but offered little vision. Luciano respected Masuria's influence but recognized his limitations. The old man treated crime as a personal empire. Luciano saw it as an industry. While Masuria was feuding with rival dons over tradition and pride, Luciano was meeting with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, discussing ways to streamline operations and reduce conflicts. These meetings were quiet, strategic, and often dangerous. If Masuria discovered he was consulting Jewish gangsters without permission, the consequences would have been deadly. But Luciano believed that the future belonged to those who built alliances, not barriers. One of the pivotal lessons Rothstein had taught him was that information was worth more than bullets. Luciano began cultivating informants, bribing police officers, and building relationships with politicians who could offer him protection or insight. He learned how to disguise criminal meetings as social gatherings, how to tuck illicit transactions behind legitimate businesses, how to control outcomes without appearing to be involved. This ability to operate in the shadows while maintaining a charming public presence became one of his defining traits. He was visible enough to be respected, but not so exposed that he became a target. Despite the sophistication he brought to the underworld, Luciano never forgot the most essential truth he learned as a child. Power required force behind it. Diplomacy could build an empire, but intimidation kept it safe. He mastered a balance that few gangsters could achieve, cooperating with rivals when it benefited him, neutralizing them when they became obstacles. He was not impulsive like Siegel or overly calculating like Lansky. Instead, he was the perfect blend of both. He possessed a rare charisma that allowed him to sit with politicians one moment and street killers the next without ever seeming out of place. As his influence spread, he began experimenting with organizational structures that mirrored legitimate corporations. He created delegated roles within the gang, men responsible for finances, supply chains, enforcement, and political connections. He rewarded loyalty with money rather than promises, knowing that financial incentive could bind a man more tightly than family ties. He also began keeping a mental Rolodex of talents: arsonists, safecrackers, negotiators, smugglers, enforcers. He believed in giving people responsibilities that matched their strengths, a method unheard of among the rigid mafia hierarchies of the time. What truly separated Luciano from his contemporaries was his vision for unity. He recognized that the constant wars between Italian factions were weakening everyone. If the criminal world was ever to reach its full potential, it needed structure, order, and cooperation. He dreamed of a commission, a governing body where disputes could be settled through votes rather than violence. But before he could bring that vision to life, he needed to rise high enough within the mafia to influence change. That meant playing a dangerous game, pretending loyalty to leaders whose time was ending while secretly preparing for a new era. His transformation into a modern mobster wasn't sudden. It was an accumulation of experiences, mentors, relationships, beatings, victories, and losses. Each chapter of his early criminal career refined him. Each betrayal taught him caution. Each alliance taught him strategy. Each risk taught him patience. He was building not just a criminal empire, but an identity, a leader who could navigate both the brutality of the streets and the sophistication of boardroom-style decision-making. By the late 1920s, Luciano was no longer just a key figure in Masuria's organization. He was the quiet force shaping a new vision of organized crime. He had built alliances across ethnic lines, studied under one of the brightest criminal minds in America, and surrounded himself with partners whose skills complemented his own. He had learned to think like a businessman, act like a diplomat, and strike like a predator. The old mafia still saw him as a talented young lieutenant. The underworld's rising generation saw him as the future. And Luciano himself? He saw a world ready to be rebuilt, one decision, one alliance, one act of calculated power at a time. The old mafia had always defined itself by omerta, a rigid code of silence rooted in Sicilian tradition. It was more than a rule, it was a religion, an unwritten vow that bound men tighter than family, tighter than law, tighter even than fear. In Sicily, omerta meant survival. Silence protected entire villages from the reach of corrupt officials, foreign invaders, and rival clans. But in America, the landscape had changed. The old code clashed with new realities, new money, new enemies, and a new generation of criminals who were not shaped by the mountains of Palermo but by the steel, noise, and ambition of New York City. This was where Luciano began reshaping the meaning of loyalty itself, turning omerta into something practical, strategic, and ruthlessly efficient. For the mustache Petes, omerta was absolute. A man could lose everything, his livelihood, his freedom, his life, but he could not break silence or question authority. They believed in a hierarchy carved in stone, where elders commanded obedience simply because they were elders. But Luciano saw the flaws in this system. He saw how blind loyalty to tradition caused men to die in pointless vendettas, how silence protected bosses who abused their power, and how the code prevented the mafia from adapting to a rapidly changing world. To him, loyalty was valuable only when it served a purpose. Faithfulness to outdated customs was not strength, it was weakness disguised as honor. He began shaping a new understanding of power, one that blended respect with practicality. In Luciano's world, loyalty wasn't earned through fear alone, but through opportunity and reward. A man stayed loyal when he benefited from the system, when he saw a future for himself, when the organization offered upward mobility rather than rigid submission. Luciano understood the psychology of men who lived outside the law. These were individuals who craved recognition, who wanted to matter, who wanted to grow. The old mafia kept them trapped. Luciano gave them a path forward. And in doing so, he rewrote the foundation of the underworld. His version of omerta still demanded silence. No one talked to the police, no one betrayed the family. But he also introduced something new: communication within the ranks. Instead of making decisions from an isolated throne like the old bosses, Luciano believed in sharing information with key members, creating internal trust. By empowering others, he gained their loyalty more firmly than fear ever could. Men like Castello, Genovese, Adonis, Siegel, and Lansky remained loyal not because tradition required it, but because Luciano made them indispensable. He created a circle of trusted allies who felt like partners, not subordinates. But loyalty in Luciano's world was never unconditional. He understood that men changed, alliances shifted, ambition could rot the heart, and fear could make a friend betray you. So, instead of relying solely on trust, he relied on structure. He created multiple channels of information, used spies inside rival factions, and positioned himself so that betrayal would always cost his enemies more than it would reward them. He believed in loyalty, but he believed even more in foresight. Fear still played a role in his system, but it was targeted, controlled. He never unleashed violence recklessly. Instead, he used it like a scalpel, precise, intentional, leaving a message that would echo far longer than a random killing. Luciano knew that brutality without purpose led to chaos. But brutality used strategically created order. When someone broke the rules, when someone betrayed an alliance, when someone threatened the stability he was building, he acted swiftly and decisively. His reputation became a warning whispered in backrooms. Luciano was calm until the moment he wasn't, and that moment always came at the right time. His new code also embraced something the old guard refused to acknowledge: collaboration with outsiders. The Mustache Petes believed only Sicilians were worthy of trust. Luciano believed trust wasn't determined by blood but by reliability. Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster with no Sicilian lineage, became one of his closest confidants. Bugsy Siegel, brash and unpredictable, became a vital component of his operations. Luciano understood that diversity brought strength. Different backgrounds meant different skills, and different skills meant more profit. Omerta, in his eyes, wasn't about ethnicity or birthplace. It was about shared goals and shared risks. In a world where criminal networks expanded across ethnic and political lines, this shift in philosophy was revolutionary. It allowed Luciano to form coalitions that older bosses would have considered blasphemous. It enabled him to negotiate with the Irish, collaborate with the Jews, and communicate with bootleggers, politicians, and union leaders without ever appearing disloyal to his roots. His modernized code of loyalty was flexible when necessary, unbreakable when essential. Yet beneath all of this evolution, Luciano still understood the emotional weight of Omerta. He recognized that for many men, silence was not just a rule but a deeply held identity. So he blended tradition with innovation. He maintained rituals, honored the symbolism of brotherhood, and respected the culture he came from. But he filtered out the parts that kept the Mafia small, poor, or divided. He kept the spirit of the old code while discarding the shackles. This balance made him uniquely powerful. He could speak to old-world dons in their own language, respecting their customs, while simultaneously guiding younger gangsters toward a new era of professionalism. He was a bridge between worlds, Sicilian in origin, American in ambition, and global in vision. His understanding of the human mind allowed him to unify men who otherwise would have gone to war with one another. Luciano's redefined code also introduced something the old Mafia had never considered: accountability. If a boss made decisions that endangered the organization, he could be removed. This concept was shocking to traditional leaders, but to the younger generation it represented progress. Luciano believed the Mafia should be governed not by age or lineage but by competence. A leader had to earn respect continuously, not simply inherit it. In this new world, even a powerful don could be replaced if he jeopardized the future of the organization. This shift laid the psychological foundation for the commission he would later create, the governing body that would regulate disputes, approve major actions, and oversee the American Mafia as a collective enterprise. But long before the commission took shape, it existed in Luciano's mind as an idea rooted in his reimagined version of Omerta: loyalty to the system, not to a single man. This evolution of the code marked a turning point in the history of organized crime. It transformed the Mafia from a cluster of feuding clans into an emerging institution, disciplined, strategic, adaptable. And at the center of this transformation was Luciano, a man who understood that the greatest power came not from forcing others to obey, but from creating a world where obedience was the logical choice. He built a system that rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, and ensured that the underworld, for the first time, had a structure capable of surviving beyond one man's reign. The transformation of the American Mafia from a loose patchwork of feuding clans into a unified criminal institution did not happen by accident. It was engineered, piece by piece, in the dim backrooms of speakeasies, in whispered conversations between unlikely allies, and in the calculated silences between men who understood that power was shifting beneath their feet. At the center of this transformation stood Lucky Luciano, a man who saw what others could not, a future where organized crime would be as structured as any major corporation, where disputes could be settled by votes rather than bullets, and where the Mafia would operate like a silent government guiding the underworld from behind velvet curtains. But before he could build that new world, he had to survive the old one. The Castellammarese War was the crucible that shaped Luciano's vision into action. Beginning in 1930, it was a brutal internal conflict between two powerful factions. Joe, the boss Masuria whom Luciano publicly served, and Salvatore Maranzano, a calculating Sicilian don from Castellamare del Golfo. The war was not merely about territory, it was a collision between generations. The mustache Petes fought to preserve tradition, while the younger, Americanized gangsters fought for modernization. Luciano found himself caught in the middle, perfectly positioned to reshape the outcome. He understood that neither Masuria nor Maranzano represented the future. Both men were relics clinging to outdated hierarchies that stifled growth and provoked violence. While outwardly loyal to Masuria, Luciano secretly formed alliances with men from the opposing faction. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Benny Siegel, and others who shared his philosophy. These men saw the constant bloodshed as senseless waste. They wanted efficiency, stability, and profit. And they recognized Luciano as the only leader capable of delivering it. He cultivated trust quietly, ensuring every conversation, every shared whiskey, every handshake strengthened a new coalition rising beneath the war's surface. The war raged through New York with a level of violence the city had rarely seen. Kidnappings, ambushes, street assassinations. Each faction struck blindly, desperate to maintain dominance. But Luciano was done fighting someone else's war. He knew the only path to progress was to end the conflict entirely. That meant removing Masuria. That meant removing Maranzano. And it meant doing so in a way that left him not simply alive, but positioned as the architect of a new system. The first move was to eliminate Masuria. Luciano orchestrated a betrayal that was both shocking and inevitable. In April 1931, he invited Masuria to a quiet lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. As Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, a team of trusted gunmen stormed in and murdered Masuria in a hail of bullets. It was the end of the old boss and the beginning of Luciano's ascent. In the aftermath, Maranzano emerged victorious, declaring himself boss of bosses over all Mafia families. He reorganized the families into 5 distinct groups but ruled them with the same old-world rigidity. Luciano recognized instantly that Maranzano's victory was only temporary. Maranzano's leadership style, authoritarian, paranoid, obsessed with hierarchy, threatened everything Luciano hoped to build. He demanded pure Sicilian leadership, distrusted American-born gangsters, and treated the Mafia as if it were his personal kingdom. He also secretly ordered Luciano's assassination, fearing his growing popularity and modern ideas. But Luciano learned of the plot and responded with his own. On September 10, 1931, a group of killers disguised as treasury agents entered Maranzano's office and ended his reign with brutal efficiency. It was the last gasp of the old Mafia and the first breath of the new era Luciano had envisioned. With both Masuria and Maranzano gone, the Mafia was leaderless, fractured, exhausted but ready for change. Luciano seized the moment. He gathered the most influential mob leaders from across New York and other major cities. He spoke not as a dictator demanding obedience, but as a strategist offering a plan. Instead of a single boss of bosses, he proposed a democratic structure, the Commission. Each major Mafia family would have a seat at the table. Decisions would be made collectively, disputes resolved through mediation, and major actions approved by majority vote. It was the first time in American organized crime that power was decentralized, shared, and regulated. The creation of the Commission was more than an organizational change. It was a psychological shift. Luciano reframed the Mafia not as a collection of violent clans but as a unified national institution. He convinced the families that cooperation was more profitable than competition, that peace was more valuable than pride, and that long-term stability would benefit everyone far more than endless wars. Through charisma, logic, and a quiet but unmistakable aura of authority, he won their trust. Even those who feared him respected his vision. Under this new system, each family operated autonomously, managing its own rackets and territories. But the Commission acted as a supreme court of the underworld. Killings of high-profile figures required approval. New leaders were vetted. Conflicts were mediated before they escalated to violence. The commission also opened channels of communication across ethnic lines. Luciano recognized the strength of Jewish and Irish gangs, and he ensured the Italian Mafia treated them as partners rather than enemies. The Syndicate, a vast multi-ethnic criminal network, was born from this philosophy. And yet, for all the structure, Luciano understood that institutions required enforcement. Behind the commission sat secret enforcers, trusted men who ensured rules were respected. If someone violated a deal, ignored a ruling, or threatened unity, the consequences were swift. Luciano never advertised this system. He didn't need to. The whisper of a punishment was often more effective than the punishment itself. He turned fear into a quiet but powerful stabilizer. The commission also introduced financial collaboration. Families pooled resources for major ventures: gambling, narcotics, labor infiltration, political influence. Luciano treated the Mafia like a corporation with departments, revenue streams, investments, and carefully monitored risk. He encouraged diversification, pushing members to expand beyond bootlegging into unions, nightclubs, construction, and other industries where influence could yield enormous profit. Because of this, the Mafia's reach extended beyond New York, into Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, New Jersey, Kansas City, and beyond. The commission became the Underworld's Congress, and Luciano was its silent prime minister. What made this era extraordinary was how invisible Luciano remained. He did not sit on a throne, he sat at a table. He did not command armies, he facilitated cooperation. But every man knew that this system was his creation, and without him, it could collapse into chaos. His genius lay in balancing ego, allowing others to feel powerful while holding the strings that connected every part of the operation. By establishing the commission, Luciano achieved what no gangster before him had accomplished. He turned crime into an institution. He created a governing body built not on bloodlines or superstition, but on strategy, diplomacy, and shared prosperity. The old Mafia had ruled with fear, Luciano ruled with vision. And in doing so, he carved his name into the very architecture of the American underworld, a name that would echo long after his enemies, his allies, and even the world he built had begun to fade. The empire Luciano built did not rise in isolation. Power in the underworld was never a solitary achievement. It was a delicate web woven from alliances, rivalries, favors, and threats. Every decision he made carried consequences across a criminal landscape filled with brilliant minds, volatile tempers, and men whose loyalties could shift like smoke in the wind. Luciano understood better than anyone that power was not held, it was managed. And managing it required navigating a shifting terrain of allies and enemies, each with their own ambitions, insecurities, and dangerous potentials. His closest confidants formed the core of his strength. Meyer Lansky, the quiet strategist with a mind like a razor, was perhaps the most important. Lansky saw the world through numbers, probabilities, and cold logic. He didn't believe in luck, only preparation. He kept records in his head, analyzed risks with mathematical precision, and approached crime like finance. Luciano trusted him not simply because of loyalty, but because Lansky embodied the disciplined thinking the new syndicate needed. Together, they envisioned a national network of gambling operations, narcotics routes, labor rackets, and investments that crossed ethnic boundaries in ways old-world mobsters would have considered unthinkable. Then there was Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, a man with a politician's smile and a diplomat's tongue. Costello could walk into a room full of senators, business leaders, or judges and leave with promises, influence, or immunity. Where Lansky manipulated numbers, Costello manipulated people. Luciano valued this ability immensely. In a world where bullets could kill a man but only politics could protect an empire, Costello was indispensable. He built bridges, brokered deals with union leaders, bought police captains, and maintained the illusion that the Mafia's influence was far less pervasive than it truly was. Vito Genovese, however, was different. He was powerful, ambitious, and dangerous, loyal to Luciano but driven by a hunger for power that could never be truly contained. Genovese saw himself as a future Don, a man destined for the top no matter who stood in his way. Luciano kept Genovese close not because he trusted him, but because he understood the value of proximity to a threat. Better to have a rattlesnake at arm's length than lurking in the shadows. Genovese handled violence with an efficiency that bordered on cold-blooded artistry. When something needed to be done quietly, permanently, and without negotiation, Genovese was the man who carried it out. Joe Adonis added another layer to this inner circle. charismatic, stylish, and fiercely loyal to Luciano. He was the enforcer with a showman's flair, a man who could intimidate with charm as easily as he could with brutality. Adonis connected Luciano to New Jersey operations, union rackets, and a network of nightclub owners who funneled money and influence back into the syndicate. He was the type of man who would die before betraying Luciano, and Luciano valued him for that unwavering loyalty. But the underworld was never built solely on allies. Enemies were just as essential to understanding Luciano's rise. Each adversary represented a different threat, ideological, territorial, or personal. Dutch Schultz was one such enemy, volatile, unpredictable, and dangerously ambitious. Schultz controlled lucrative numbers rackets in Harlem and was notorious for his temper. When federal prosecutors targeted him, Rudolph Giuliani's predecessor Thomas Dewey became Schultz's obsession. Schultz wanted Dewey dead, believing it was the only way to stop prosecution. Luciano and the commission disagreed. Killing a prosecutor of Dewey's prominence would bring a tidal wave of public fury and federal pressure. Schultz, however, refused to listen. In Luciano's world, disobedience was a death sentence if it endangered the stability he worked so carefully to build. The commission voted. The risk was too high. And so, in 1935, Dutch Schultz was eliminated in a Newark steakhouse. It was not a personal decision, it was a strategic one, a sign to every member of the underworld that the new system demanded discipline. Luciano never celebrated Schultz's death. He didn't need to. The message spread more effectively when spoken through actions rather than words. Another adversary loomed in the form of law enforcement, particularly Thomas Dewey. Dewey was young, ambitious, incorruptible, and determined to dismantle organized crime. He saw Luciano as the embodiment of everything he sought to eradicate. Unlike many prosecutors of the time, Dewey couldn't be bribed or intimidated. His rise mirrored Luciano's in a way, two young men driven by intelligence and ambition, destined to collide. Dewey did not operate like the corrupt cops Luciano was used to dealing with. He was a strategist, a public figure, and a political force. Luciano recognized that Dewey was not just an enemy, he was a threat to the entire structure of the syndicate. Yet even with external enemies, the greatest danger often came from within. Men like Maranzano had shown Luciano that paranoia could turn allies into executioners. But the post-war era brought new rivals, new factions, and new internal pressures. Some resented the commission. Some resented the loss of old world power. Others simply resented Luciano's dominance. Rumors circulated constantly, whispers of betrayal, murmurs of discontent, hints that not everyone accepted the new order. Luciano managed these tensions with a blend of diplomacy and subtle intimidation. He met with discontented leaders privately, listened to their grievances, and offered solutions that often left them feeling heard, respected, or indebted. But always, behind the calm exterior, Luciano carried the unspoken promise of consequences. He understood that leadership wasn't about inspiring loyalty alone, it was about making rebellion seem not only dangerous but irrational. One of the most fascinating dynamics in Luciano's network was his relationship with Bugsy Siegel. Siegel was not a strategist like Lansky or a diplomat like Costello, he was a firebrand, a whirlwind of charm and violence. Luciano admired him because Siegel represented the raw energy of American crime, the boldness of a man who refused to live quietly. Siegel's unpredictability made him both a useful weapon and a potential liability. Luciano used him carefully, knowing he was a spark in a world where sparks sometimes started fires. But Siegel's charisma also forged invaluable connections, especially in Hollywood and Las Vegas, connections that would eventually lay the foundation for the syndicate's westward expansion. Luciano understood that potential. He also understood the risks. He kept Siegel close enough to use his talents, but never close enough to let his impulsiveness threaten the system. Navigating allies and enemies required constant vigilance. Luciano spent nights in smoky clubs analyzing gestures, tones, and glances. He interpreted silence as carefully as speech. He made mental notes of shifting attitudes, subtle resentments, and quiet loyalties. The underworld was a psychological battlefield, and Luciano moved through it with the precision of a chess master always thinking 3 moves ahead. Every ally strengthened him. Every enemy sharpened him. Every betrayal, real or imagined, taught him something essential about human nature. By mastering these dynamics, Luciano didn't just rise to power, he stabilized that power. He engineered relationships that created balance, competition, unity, and controlled friction. The underworld became an interconnected system, carefully managed but always volatile, like a great machine that needed constant maintenance. In Luciano's world, allies were never simply friends and enemies were never merely threats. They were instruments, pieces of a larger design. And in the intricate dance between loyalty, ambition, and survival, Luciano proved that understanding people was the greatest weapon a man could wield. Even as Lucky Luciano reshaped the underworld into something more stable, more strategic, and more profitable, beneath the polished surface there remained a quiet war. One fought not only with guns and knives, but with shadows, silence, and shifting agendas. The world he was building depended on peace, but maintaining peace required constant vigilance. Every territory, every racket, every alliance was a moving part, and any one of them could become the spark that ignited chaos if left unchecked. The commission had been designed to prevent exactly that, yet the criminal world existed in a perpetual state of tension. Rivalries simmered just below the surface, law enforcement tightened its grip as profits grew, and Luciano's own position demanded that he manage conflicts the public never saw. On the streets, prosperity created its own form of pressure. Prohibition had turned gangsters into millionaires, but wealth also bred envy. Small-time hoodlums wanted a bigger piece of the pie. Family captains wanted more respect. Younger gangsters wanted faster promotions. It was not enough to build an empire, Luciano had to make sure it didn't devour itself. He knew the dangers of rapid growth. He'd seen organizations collapse when strong profits made weak men reckless. So he divided responsibilities carefully, watching every sector of the underworld as if he were monitoring a volatile stock market. At the same time, outside forces were tightening their grip. The federal government was no longer indifferent to organized crime. The sheer scale of illegal alcohol distribution had transformed the Mafia into a national threat, drawing attention from reformers, federal agents, and ambitious prosecutors. And nowhere was that threat more concentrated than in the form of Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey's relentless pursuit of vice and racketeering operations wasn't just political, it was personal. He believed that crime thrived on corruption and weakness, and that attacking its leadership was the only way to crush it. Luciano, for Dewey, became the symbol of everything that needed to be destroyed. This growing pressure from law enforcement forced Luciano to adapt. He refined communication methods, eliminated unnecessary exposure, and encouraged front businesses to act as shields. Nightclubs, casinos, and union offices became meeting grounds where deals could be disguised as ordinary business transactions. Luciano insisted on discipline. No flashy violence, no reckless displays of wealth, no unnecessary media attention. But discipline wasn't always easy to maintain. Men who grew rich quickly often forgot the rules that got them there. Within the Mafia itself, rivalries between factions were always lurking, waiting for the slightest opportunity to resurface. The political tensions that had fueled the Castellammarese War did not vanish with Maranzano's death, they merely sank deeper underground. Older Sicilian members still resented Luciano's willingness to collaborate with outsiders. They whispered that he was abandoning tradition. They complained that young Americanized gangsters, men like Bugsy Siegel or Joe Adonis, were gaining too much influence. Luciano met these complaints with calm but firm resolve. He reminded the old guard that profit was the new tradition, and survival depended on evolution. But even he knew that tradition had a long memory and sharp teeth. One of the most volatile threats emerged from within the Jewish underworld. While Meyer Lansky remained Luciano's closest ally, other Jewish gangs were not always aligned with his vision. Some operated independently, pushing drug routes or gambling operations without considering the balance Luciano worked so hard to maintain. Bugsy Siegel, brilliant but impulsive, drew law enforcement attention with his flamboyant lifestyle, unpredictable violence, and bold ventures. Siegel was profitable, but he was also a magnet for trouble. Luciano valued him, but he also recognized that Siegel, if not carefully managed, could ignite a conflict that would ripple through the entire syndicate. Another hidden war existed on the docks and in unions. The Mafia's infiltration of labor organizations granted immense power, control over shipping, construction, trucking, and waterfront operations. But with power came disputes between families that wanted bigger shares. These labor rackets were gold mines and every family wanted a taste. Luciano's challenge was to prevent these disputes from turning violent. He acted as an arbitrator, meeting with captains and lieutenants to negotiate percentages, territories, and responsibilities. Many times he diffused tension not with threats, but by making each party feel fairly compensated. But he knew that fairness was subjective, and envy was a poison no amount of diplomacy could fully cure. Meanwhile, New York's nightlife exploded with money and influence. Speakeasies, nightclubs, and gambling parlors became social hubs for entertainers, politicians, and businessmen. Luciano used these hotspots to strengthen relationships and expand the Mafia's reach. But nightlife came with its own shadows. Celebrities attracted gossip. Wealth attracted reporters. Police raids became common. Spies and informants blended into crowds. Rival families sometimes planted saboteurs disguised as bartenders, performers, or waiters. Luciano responded by embedding trusted men in key venues, silent watchers who ensured that every whisper, every shift, every suspicious stranger was noted. Even as he managed internal disputes and external threats, Luciano confronted a more subtle conflict: the increasing ambition of his own allies. Power has a way of expanding men's desires. Frank Costello wanted greater political influence. Vito Genovese wanted to control more territories. Meyer Lansky wanted national expansion. Bugsy Siegel wanted to build his own kingdom out west. Each man's ambition was both an asset and a risk. Luciano understood that a strong empire required strong generals, but strong generals also dreamed of crowns. He walked a fine line between empowering them and ensuring they didn't grow too independent. Genovese in particular posed unique danger. His hunger for leadership bordered on obsession. He agreed with Luciano's vision but resented that he wasn't the one implementing it. Luciano saw the fire in Genovese's eyes: dangerous, unblinking, always calculating. Their alliance was built on necessity, not trust. Luciano kept him close but always under watch, aware that one day Genovese might strike from within. And then there was the rising public scrutiny. Newspapers loved stories of high-profile murders, mysterious bootlegging bosses, and glamorous gangsters walking out of courtrooms with confident smirks. Luciano understood that the public's fascination was a double-edged sword. Fame provided influence, but it also made him a target. To counteract this, he kept a low profile: no flamboyant displays, no unnecessary attention, no reckless behavior. But even silence could not shield him from the growing conviction in political circles that he was too powerful to ignore. This era, often romanticized as the Mafia's golden age, was in truth a constant tightrope walk. Luciano had created order, but only through perpetual vigilance. Every day brought new threats: street gangs seeking entry into the syndicate, greedy captains testing boundaries, corrupt officials demanding higher bribes, federal agents analyzing patterns, and competitors probing for weakness. Violence didn't disappear, it merely became strategic, controlled, a last resort rather than an instinct. In the end, the hidden war wasn't a single conflict but a collection of battles fought silently in every corner of the underworld. Luciano's genius lay not in defeating enemies with force, but in anticipating danger, balancing egos, negotiating peace, and keeping a fractured criminal world functioning like a machine. He fought wars through whispers long before they ever reached the sound of gunfire. Through this invisible battlefield, he secured a fragile peace, one that would hold only as long as he remained the man capable of seeing every angle, every threat, every flicker of ambition that could one day ignite into open conflict. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the peak of his power. The commission was stable, the rackets were profitable, the streets were relatively quiet. For the first time in decades, the American underworld operated with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. But at the same moment that Luciano believed he had created lasting order, forces beyond his control began tightening like a noose around his empire. The fall did not begin with a bullet or a betrayal. It began with a shift in the wind: ambition in the courts, pressure from the press, and a national appetite for heroes, men who would rise up against the corruption that had long been whispered about but rarely confronted. Luciano had engineered the most disciplined criminal system America had ever seen. But now he was about to face a system far more disciplined than his own: the law. At the center of this rising legal storm was a man whose ambition rivaled Luciano's own: Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was young, relentless, and determined to make his name by taking down organized crime. He did not care about tradition, ethnic politics, or the balance Luciano had carefully constructed. He saw the underworld as a disease, one he felt morally obligated to eradicate. More importantly, Dewey was incorruptible, the one kind of enemy Luciano could not negotiate with. Bribes failed. Intimidation failed. Threats failed. Dewey remained a stone wall that bullets and money could not move. Dewey began attacking Luciano's empire piece by piece. He investigated bootlegging networks, infiltrated vice operations, targeted union bosses, and pressured small-time operators to flip. But the true opening came from the vice trade, New York's sprawling network of brothels, gambling dens, and prostitution rings. It was a world Luciano did not directly control but benefited from through profit cuts and protection payments. Dewey understood that if he could tie Luciano to the prostitution racket, he could build a case strong enough to justify a public trial, one that would shock New York and cement his reputation. The pressure intensified. Newspapers ran stories linking Luciano to the city's most notorious brothels. Journalists portrayed him as the puppet master of every vice operation from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Politicians began demanding action. Dewey seized the moment. He orchestrated a series of raids targeting brothel owners, madams, and prostitutes. Many had never heard Luciano's name directly, but Dewey's team used fear, leverage, and promises of immunity to force cooperation. Witness after witness began to claim Luciano was the boss behind the scenes, whether they believed it or not. Dewey was building a narrative, and a narrative, once given to the public, became as powerful as evidence. For Luciano, this tightening grip felt different from the usual threats. Rival gangsters he could negotiate with. Hitmen he could counter. Disloyal allies he could eliminate. But Dewey operated by different rules. His attack was clean, legal, and surrounded by public applause. Luciano tried to fight quietly. He met with lawyers, tried to trace the origins of the accusations, and ordered his men to find holes in Dewey's case. But the situation grew worse in the shadows. While Dewey hunted him from the outside, Luciano faced cracks forming from within his own empire. Men like Vito Genovese sensed opportunity. Ambition began to stir in dangerous corners. Some captains wondered if Luciano had grown too comfortable, too visible. Others worried that the Commission's unified structure made it too easy for law enforcement to target them as a collective. Rumors circulated quietly that Luciano's arrest might actually benefit certain men. That his leadership, once indisputable, was no longer invincible. Even trusted allies felt the pressure. Frank Costello tried to use political connections to slow the investigation, but Dewey was protected by public support. Meyer Lansky advised Luciano to keep a low profile, reduce meetings, and avoid unnecessary travel. But it didn't matter. Dewey had chosen him as the symbol of American crime, and symbols were not allowed to slip away quietly. In April 1936, Dewey struck. Luciano was arrested in Arkansas during what he believed was a harmless trip out of town. He had grown accustomed to traveling freely, believing that his low public profile protected him. But Dewey had been monitoring his movements for months. The arrest shocked the underworld, not because Luciano had been caught, but because the case against him seemed outrageous. Luciano insisted he had no connection to prostitution, that the charges were exaggerated or fabricated. But public sentiment didn't care. Dewey portrayed him as the mastermind behind a corrupt empire, and people wanted to believe it. They wanted a villain to blame for the city's moral decay. Luciano became that villain. Back in New York, Dewey paraded his arrest to the press. Headlines screamed that the era of underworld rule was ending. Prosecutors announced they would demand the maximum penalty. Luciano's enemies smelled blood. Politicians praised Dewey, seeing him as a rising star. Even ordinary citizens, who benefited from the Mafia's hidden order whether they knew it or not, cheered the fall of the man they called the king of the underworld. Luciano remained calm, but inside he felt the ground shifting. He trusted his allies to hold the empire together, but he knew how ambition could twist loyalty. He trusted his lawyers, but he knew the courts were becoming hostile. He trusted his instincts, but even they warned him that Dewey's case was too meticulously crafted to dismiss. And beneath all the strategic thinking, a more personal emotion gnawed at him: betrayal. Some of the witnesses who testified against him were people he had protected, financed, or negotiated with. Some had been small-time workers who had benefited from the stability the syndicate created. Others were opportunists simply saying what Dewey wanted to hear. Luciano understood betrayal, it was part of the underworld, but seeing it executed in courtrooms rather than alleyways felt like a different kind of wound. Meanwhile, the commission scrambled to manage the fallout. Costello and Lansky considered ways to challenge the narrative. Genovese quietly calculated how he might benefit. Adonis emphasized loyalty, urging patience. But no one could deny the truth. The empire was under siege and its architect was at risk of being removed permanently. As the months dragged on, the hidden war reached its climax. The streets remained deceptively calm, but the underworld was a pressure cooker. Every man waited to see whether Luciano would escape or fall. Every family wondered how the balance of power might shift. Every rival considered what chaos or opportunity might emerge when the dust settled. And in the middle of it all, Luciano faced the realization that even the most powerful criminal in America could not outrun the weight of the law when the law was led by a man as relentless as Dewey. The fall had begun, not with a gunshot but with an indictment. Not with a betrayal in the shadows, but with a courtroom spotlight aimed directly at him. The underworld might have been built on fear, loyalty, and silence, but now it was being threatened by something far more dangerous: public exposure. Luciano's trial began long before he ever stepped into a courtroom. It began the moment Thomas E. Dewey decided that the Lord of Crime must fall, not because of a single act, but because of what he represented. By the time the official proceedings opened in 1936, the public had already formed its verdict. Newspapers painted Luciano as the hidden hand behind every vice operation in the city, a man whose quiet smile masked an empire built on moral decay. Dewey understood the power of perception. He didn't simply prosecute Luciano, he crafted a story. And once the world believed that story, the courtroom became a stage upon which the conclusion would unfold. The city buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, journalists pressed against barricades, photographers waited to capture the image of the powerful mob boss finally constrained. For years, Luciano had moved through New York's social circles like a ghost, present, influential, but rarely seen. Now for the first time he stood in the harsh glow of public judgment. Reporters marveled that he didn't look like the monster they'd imagined. Well-dressed, calm, barely lifting his eyes from the table, he carried himself with the poise of a businessman rather than a criminal king. But this composure only fed the media's fascination. A man so calm must be hiding something monumental. A man so confident must have ruled something immense. Dewey's prosecution opened with theatrical precision. Witness after witness took the stand. Madams, prostitutes, low-level operators from the underworld's vice trade. Many trembled as they spoke, pressured or incentivized into cooperation. Dewey coached them, guiding their testimonies like a conductor shaping a performance. They described Luciano as a shadowy overlord, the man to whom all money ultimately flowed. The prosecution insisted that every brothel worker, every pimp, every madam kicked a portion of their profits to Luciano's men. Through repetition the narrative grew stronger. Luciano's attorneys objected, questioned credibility, pointed out inconsistencies. But the prosecution countered with volume. Dozens of witnesses, dozens of statements, dozens of accusations. Behind the scenes, Luciano fumed, not outwardly but within. He felt betrayed by people he'd never met, trapped inside a story that had taken on a life of its own. He had never considered himself a moral guardian, but he despised the idea of being linked to prostitution. In the criminal code of the time, vice was seen as dirty, undignified work, something low-level gangs handled, not the high-level syndicate leaders. He believed Dewey was manipulating the public, twisting reality until the man on trial was a caricature. But Luciano also knew something darker. The truth didn't matter now. The story had been written. The trial was merely the public reading. The defense attempted to undermine the prosecution by highlighting the questionable backgrounds of the witnesses. Many were criminals themselves. Some had records for fraud, theft, extortion. Others were known to have lied under oath in the past. Dewey anticipated this and leaned into it. He argued that only criminals could expose criminals, that the very nature of the vice world required unsavory testimony. His confidence resonated with the jury. Dewey had an aura of righteousness, a youthful intensity that made him seem like the city's guardian. In contrast, Luciano's silence, even though strategic, made him appear distant, unrepentant, untouchable. Then came the most damaging witnesses, the ones who claimed to have seen Luciano personally collecting money or giving orders. Their stories were inconsistent, timelines didn't match, and many lacked evidence. But Dewey used emotion, not logic. He painted Luciano as a man so powerful, so insulated, that evidence would be scarce. Power, Dewey argued, hides itself. But its effects are unmistakable. It was a masterstroke. Suddenly the absence of hard proof became proof itself. If Luciano's hands appeared clean, it was only because he had kept them clean while others dirted theirs on his behalf. The media transformed this logic into headlines. Every newspaper bought into the narrative. Editorials declared that the trial was not just about one man, but about breaking the spine of organized crime. Public sentiment drowned out skepticism. Luciano's lawyers fought against a wave that could not be stopped. They offered alibis, challenged dates, and questioned motives, but the momentum had shifted. Even the jurors, though silent, felt the weight of the city on their shoulders. They were not just deciding the fate of a man, They were determining whether New York would tolerate the underworld's influence. The trial stretched on for weeks. Tension hung in the air like smoke. Inside the courtroom, Dewey maintained his fierce composure, interrogating witnesses with sharp questions designed to leave impressions, not clarity. Luciano remained expressionless, controlling his temper even as lie after lie piled upon him. His lawyers urged him to testify, to show the jury his human side. But Luciano refused. In his world, powerful men did not plead. They did not explain. They did not beg. Silence was his armor, even if it cost him everything. When closing arguments arrived, Dewey delivered a final blow. He spoke calmly, almost softly, forcing the room to lean in. He described a man who built an empire through fear, a man who hid behind lieutenants, a man whose influence corrupted entire industries. Dewey didn't simply argue the evidence. He argued the moral necessity of a guilty verdict. If this man walks free, he declared, crime will never fear justice again. The words struck like a hammer. The courtroom fell into heavy silence. The jury deliberated. Hours passed, then a full day. Outside, crowds grew restless. Reporters prepared their headlines. Inside his holding cell, Luciano sat alone, replaying every moment of the trial, every witness, every slip, every missed opportunity. For the first time he felt something he had rarely allowed himself to feel: uncertainty. He had engineered peace, built alliances, created structure. But he could not control this. He could not bribe this. He could not orchestrate a deal with a system that saw him as the enemy of the public good. When the jury returned, the atmosphere was suffocating. Luciano watched each juror avoid his gaze. That was the moment he knew. The words "guilty on all counts" came not as a shock but as an inevitability. Dewey had won. The public cheered. Politicians celebrated. And Luciano, the most powerful mob boss in America, stood quietly as the judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison. In that instant, the empire he had built seemed to freeze around him. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, something inside him remained unbroken. Dewey had won the battle. But Luciano, even in defeat, began thinking ahead, planning, analyzing. He had survived street wars, betrayals, assassination attempts. Now he faced a different kind of battlefield, one behind bars where freedom was gone but influence was not. The fall had begun, but the story was far from over. When the steel doors of Clinton Correctional Facility clanged shut behind Lucky Luciano, the world assumed his reign had ended. Newspaper headlines proclaimed that Dewey had defeated the underworld's greatest strategist. Politicians congratulated themselves. Ordinary citizens believed that justice had finally prevailed. But inside those cold walls of concrete and iron, Luciano did something no one expected. He adapted. He shifted, observed, recalculated. Prison took his freedom, but it did not take his mind. And in the underworld, mind was often more powerful than muscle. Dannemora was one of the harshest prisons in America, a fortress buried in the icy northern reaches of New York, notorious for brutal winters, unforgiving guards, and inmates hardened beyond redemption. The men locked inside were thieves, murderers, enforcers, forgotten souls who had long given up hope. To them, Luciano was a legend. His arrival sent a shockwave through the inmate population. Some whispered his name in awe, others in curiosity, and a few in fear. Even those who pretended not to care found themselves stealing glances as he walked through the yard, calm and composed, carrying himself with the same quiet authority that had defined his life on the outside. Luciano refused to show vulnerability. In prison, weakness was blood in the water. He entered with a straight back, measured steps, and an expression that revealed nothing. Men watched him, sizing him up. They expected him to resist the environment, to lash out or fight to maintain dominance. But Luciano did something unexpected. He blended in. Not as an equal, never that, but as a man who understood that control came from patience, not posturing. He studied routines, learned the rhythms of the guards, observed which inmates commanded respect and which ones sought it desperately. He didn't rush to assert himself. He let the prison come to him. Yet influence found him quickly. Even behind bars, the machinery of the Mafia continued to turn, and many of its gears remained loyal to Luciano. Messages traveled in ways law enforcement never understood, through coded letters, through lawyers, through men who had already memorized instructions long before the trial. Some guards, sympathetic or corrupt, became quiet intermediaries. Prison walls could not stop a network as vast and deeply rooted as the one Luciano had built. Within months, he became a central figure among the inmates. Not through violence but through mediation. When tensions flared between ethnic groups, Irish versus Italians, Italians versus blacks, Luciano stepped in subtly, guiding conversations, diffusing conflict, preventing bloodshed. Violence drew attention, and attention was a luxury he couldn't afford. His influence grew quietly in the spaces between tension and diplomacy. Men came to him for advice, for protection, for reassurance. He never charged, never demanded anything. Influence was currency enough. But his true power lay beyond the walls. Vito Genovese, despite his toxic ambition, maintained outward loyalty. Frank Costello ensured political connections remained intact. Meyer Lansky, ever calculating, continued managing financial operations, laundering money through Havana, Cuba, and various gambling enterprises. The commission Luciano had designed years earlier remained functional. Even imprisoned, he was still consulted. His approval sought for major decisions, his insight valued above all. Some members of the underworld insisted the syndicate pause major moves until they could communicate with him. It was a testament to his legacy. He had built something so structured that it survived even when its architect was entombed. The guards noticed his quiet authority. Some disliked it, others respected it. A few leveraged it. Luciano understood that power in prison worked differently. Sometimes a helping hand was worth more than a threat. He cultivated relationships without corruption. Simple gestures, respectful conversation, calm demeanor. He became a model prisoner, not out of submission but out of strategy. The more cooperative he appeared, the more freedom he quietly earned. Guards turned blind eyes during certain conversations. Supervisors allowed him to work in areas where communication became easier. Luciano did not bribe, he influenced. But prison life wore on him in ways the public never saw. Nights were long and cold. The silence was heavy, filled with the echoes of regret and memory. Luciano had always been in motion, always thinking ahead, always stepping into the next deal, the next crisis, the next victory. Now time stretched endlessly. He lay awake, replaying parts of his life. The deal that made him, the war that nearly broke him, the allies who saved him, the mistakes that haunted him. He thought about the day he walked into the Coney Island restaurant to betray Masuria, the moment he learned Maranzano planned his assassination, the vote that doomed Dutch Schultz. In the stillness of his cell, he reflected on every move and misstep. Prison forced him to confront the man behind the empire. Regret, however, never replaced resolve. Luciano became more introspective but never defeated. He used the isolation to refine his thoughts about the future. He knew he would never return to the life he once lived, not fully, but he also knew the world still needed him. He believed the Mafia could grow beyond street crime, beyond prohibition, beyond New York. He believed it could become an international structure, a network stretching from America to Cuba to Europe. And he believed he still had a role to play. Then came World War II. Rumors spread through the prison that the U.S. government needed help securing the docks against potential Axis sabotage. The Mafia controlled the waterfront. Luciano, despite being behind bars, still held influence over key figures like Albert Anastasia and Joseph Sox Lanza. Naval intelligence agents approached him discreetly, initiating one of the most controversial collaborations in organized crime history. The government needed security. Luciano needed leverage. It was a meeting of necessity, not morality. Through intermediaries, Luciano coordinated cooperation. Dockworkers provided intelligence. Waterfront operations tightened. German spies found the East Coast impenetrable. The government saw results, and whispers began emerging about the possibility of rewarding Luciano for his assistance. Whether his help truly altered the course of the war remains debated, but one truth was undeniable. Lucky Luciano, from within a maximum security prison, had managed to play a part in global conflict. Prison had not broken him. It had transformed him. It had forced him to shift from king to strategist, from visible leader to invisible architect. Behind bars, he learned a different kind of patience, a different kind of influence. He learned that power could survive confinement. And as the war neared its end, the question began to circulate quietly, both inside the prison and far beyond it. Would Lucky Luciano remain locked away forever, or would the government call upon him one final time? Even behind razor wire and steel doors, Luciano's story was not ending. It was merely changing course, preparing him for the next chapter. A chapter written not in New York's alleys, but in distant shores where exile, reinvention, and the final act of his legacy awaited. When Lucky Luciano stepped onto Italian soil after his deportation, exile felt like a punishment deeper than any prison sentence. Naples was familiar in language but foreign in rhythm. It was a place he understood, yet no longer belonged to. Surveillance followed him everywhere, Italian police watching him as if he were an earthquake waiting to happen. Luciano tried to live quietly, but legends never disappear quietly. Mobsters visited him, some seeking guidance, others seeking legitimacy just by being near him. Despite his forced distance from America, Luciano remained mentally connected to the empire he once commanded. Meyer Lansky sent updates, Frank Costello sought his opinion, and even younger bosses whispered about Charlie's way when making decisions. Luciano didn't give orders anymore, but his advice, soft, measured and sharpened by age, still shaped outcomes thousands of miles away. His brief return to influence came through Havana. In Cuba's casinos he felt alive again, a ghost reclaiming his throne. For a moment he experienced a resurgence. Meetings, deals, respect. But the U.S. government crushed the moment quickly, forcing Cuba to expel him. Back to Naples he went, older, slower, yet strangely introspective. In exile, Luciano walked the docks at night, remembering New York's glow, the streets he once owned, the allies who once lifted glasses to his name. He didn't regret the empire he built, but he understood it with a clarity only age provides. He had been powerful, but power had taken pieces of him along the way, friends, years, peace. By the late 1950s, Luciano was no longer a king or a prisoner. He was something in between, a philosopher of the underworld, a man living with the shadow of the world he once ruled. In his final years, Lucky Luciano became a living legend, spoken of with reverence by young gangsters and caution by the old. He moved through Naples like a man half present, his mind still drifting toward the streets of New York. Though he no longer commanded armies of men, his advice remained gold. Sicilian bosses, American visitors, and international figures all sought his insight, believing that the architect of the commission still held the clearest vision of power. But age brought more than wisdom, it brought danger too. Vito Genovese, newly powerful and deeply insecure, saw Luciano's continued influence as a silent threat. Luciano, however, refused to live in fear. He had survived too much to cower in his final years. Instead, he focused on simple routines, sipping espresso, walking seaside promenades, feeding stray dogs. He enjoyed being alive, even if life had pushed him far from the world he built. In 1962, a film producer flew to Naples to discuss a movie about Luciano's life. For Luciano it felt symbolic, a chance to shape the story that others had twisted for years. At the airport meeting he greeted the producer warmly, talking animatedly about the old days. Then suddenly he paused, as if fate had tapped him on the shoulder. He collapsed and died before reaching the hospital. No gunman, no betrayal, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet fall in a public place, at a moment when he was reflecting on his own history. His death carried an almost cinematic poetry. Across the underworld, silence followed the news. Meyer Lansky mourned. Others felt fear, others opportunity. A foundational figure was gone. An era had ended. Lucky Luciano's legacy did not fade with his death. It expanded, quietly shaping the underworld for decades. The commission he created remained the backbone of Mafia structure, a system so effective that both criminals and law enforcement studied it for years. His greatest achievement wasn't violence or fear, but organization. He transformed scattered gangs into a coordinated network, teaching them to think like businessmen rather than street fighters. But Luciano's legacy was also a paradox. He built peace through brutal decisions, unity through eliminating rivals, and stability through rules enforced with quiet ruthlessness. The Mafia grew stronger because of him, and ultimately became a larger target because of that strength. Federal agencies reshaped their strategies specifically to dismantle the machine he designed. Even as the Mafia changed, fractured, and evolved, Luciano's blueprint endured. He became more than a mob boss. He became the architect of an era, one whose shadow still stretches across the history of organized crime.